Yeah, I think that at this point, time is ripe for introducing. I think introducing two books. First of all, there is the book of Paul Copan, Is God a Moral Monster? Uh, what do you have to say about what Paul wrote as a defense of the morality of the biblical accounts?
Well, Paul says a lot of things in that book, so it's kind of difficult to. I mean, I wrote
About the genocide.
Right, yeah. Well, I agree with some of the things Paul says. Paul tends to take in that book a bit of a sort of scatter approach. He puts down 3 or 4 possibilities, and he says lots of different things. So I guess I'm by and large in agreement with him. I wouldn't necessarily make all the details the way he does. Paul says some things in there about he draws on the work of Richard Hess, and Richard Hess makes the argument that Jericho and Ai were forts; they weren't civilian centres. I don't really know enough about that sort of discussion to really comment on that, and I wouldn't, probably base as much of my defence on that line of thing. But I think Paul's right in several things. I think he's right in some of the things he says about the Old Testament in general, about the understanding the place of the Old Testament in the Christian life. Understanding that the Old Testament is God revealing His will in a particular historical situation with all the messiness of that situation. That's one thing I think Paul says in that book in general, which is correct. And that's a broader theme about the Old Testament which we could probably talk about. I think Paul is right in there to highlight the fact that the Bible uses hyperbolic language, that much of the language that's used in, say, the book of Joshua, where it says, he put the entire city to the sword, he left no survivors, he left nothing alive that breathes. I agree with Paul that language, the evidence suggests that language is hyperbole, that's not intended to be taken literally. I agree with him on that, and I agree with him probably, I would agree with him that, when you look at the text, the pervasive picture is of a picture of them gradually driving the Canaanites out, and in such a way that there will be periods of time when they're going to be coexisting with them in the land. I think that's what the text picture is. I think the picture, if you read the book of Joshua carefully, and you understand the kind of rhetoric that's being used, the kind of exaggerated hyperbolic rhetoric, it's not actually saying they went in and conquered all these cities and killed everyone. It's saying they went in, they raided some of the major centers, they won some victories there. They killed a few people, the rest fled. They sort of established a bridgehead, and then the time of the judges comes along, and they stop having any progress at all. And that's described in places highly exaggerated language. And what happens is people read that and think that exaggerated language is intended to be taken literally. But I think there's all kinds of indicators in the text and what we know about that. So I think Paul's right about that. Paul doesn't say a lot about some other things. I would say in our book I've written a lot more about. I think there's some more philosophical work about how you approach the question of when a purported revelation contradicts a moral intuition, how you approach it. And I would draw a lot more on divine command ethics, and I think the role that divine command ethics can play in addressing the question, which Paul doesn't address at all. Paul deals only with the exegetical issues. He doesn't deal with some of the more underlying philosophical issues in the book.
Okay. But now there is a huge book which has been written in response to Paul's statements, and of course, I mean, is God a moral compromiser?
That's no book. That's a book review that was put online. It's not a published book.
Yeah, but it's really quite huge by Tom Stark, and in this book, Tom challenged the assertions of Younger that that one can find any text really any text really saying, like in the book of Joshua, that all civilians had to be killed, while also not meaning it. For example, he has challenged, I think, every analogy of younger, and said that in the text, like for example, the text did not mean that a whole population had to be slaughtered. Or for example, he said about as I can't pronounce that in English. You know, the Pharaoh who boasted about having defeated Israel. How would you pronounce that?
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce that word myself. I know the one you mean. I'll have to look it up.
Anyways, he boasted about having laid waste or utterly destroyed Israel, but Tom Stark said, as far as I can remember, that the text did not probably mean annihilation, but was rather intended to mean a complete defeat and a subjugation of the people. But then he went on arguing that the book of Joshua, on the other hand, clearly teaches that the civilians had to disappear.
Well, I'm not sure. Firstly, I'm not sure that you've got Tom Stark quite right there. I mean, I don't think Tom Stark produces anything that suggests that Younger's wrong about hyperbole. I mean, Tom Stark says some things here and there along those lines, but I don't see. I mean, and you got to realize that Younger's book is actually quite comprehensive. Younger goes through Assyrian texts. It goes through the texts of the Hittites. It goes through the texts of the Egyptians. Multiple Egyptologists, some of the world's leading Egyptologists, have said that they used pervasive hyperbole. I don't see anything that in what you've cited which contests that. And in fact, Israel wasn't destroyed because Israel, I mean, obviously, Munir-Ptah did not destroy Israel. He did not kill every single man, woman, and child in Israel. That didn't happen. And some of these texts, they would have known that this wouldn't have happened. So this is we know this is pervasive hyperbole. You can't just assert that this is not pervasive hyperbole because I read someone on the internet that said that. And in fact, from memory, I think Stark in his book actually makes he actually appeals to Younger's study in certain places. He appeals to Younger's study that the rhetoric was imperialistic, for example. But that was in part of the whole reason that Younger says that the rhetoric is imperialistic is because it's hyperbolic. So I don't think Stark is saying that this language is not hyperbolic, and I don't think that I certainly haven't seen any compelling evidence that this is not the case. I mean, we're talking about leading Egyptologists like Kenneth Kitchen, who's an expert on, I think, the Ramses period, one of the world experts on the Ramses period, and he says this is hyperbolic. So what's the basis for saying this? The texts that occur in and it's not just also. I mean, it's not just also the fact that this language is used this way. I mean, we know this language is used this way hyperbolically in ancient Near Eastern texts, but we know this language is used hyperbolically within the Bible itself. Go through the Bible. I do this in our book. Go through the Bible and look at how often in the Bible, and this is not just in the book of Joshua, just in general, how often in the Bible you see the language of all people are killed, all people are wiped out, and then immediately afterwards you see that people are still alive. How often that happens. That happens repeatedly. In our book that we've got coming out, I show over and over and again. In fact, it happens. There's a line in the book of Joshua in chapter 10 when it talks about how they went and they killed them all, and then they ran. Then the survivors got to the cities. In the book of Judges, right at the start, you hear about how I think it's the city of Jerusalem, how the Jebusites, how they destroyed the city and they killed everyone, and then 3 verses later they talk about how they attacked it again and there are people in there. When it describes the conquest of when the Babylonians conquer in the end of the book of Chronicles, at the end of the Chronicle series, it talks about how the Babylonians came and invaded Israel, it uses this language that they killed all the Israelites, and then it talks about how many went into exile. So this is a pervasive feature of the text. We can show that this happens in Hittite texts. I mean, the definitive studies by people like Younger show that it happens in Hittite and Moabite texts. We can see that it happens in the Bible. Numerous commentators have made this point. I don't think you can just come online and say, "Oh, this is just false." I'm wanting to see evidence and arguments and a case that it's false, rather than just to say, "Oh, it clearly says this."
Okay, but Stark aimed at presenting a cumulative case for the thesis that the Israelites, that the authors of that diverse, not all, but diverse authors of the Bible reporting about these events really intended to convey the message that all civilians had to be blotted out. For instance, he repeatedly showed that it was not allowed for...
What's the argument? Where's the argument? You say it's repeatedly shown. What's the argument?
If, for example, or shown, he aimed at showing that that, for example, the inhabitants of Canaan weren't allowed to make a peace treaty with Israel. That it was forbidden.
Sure, they were forbidden. I mean, there is some ambiguity there because in places, but they were forbidden to make a peace treaty. But that's not what you're saying. You're saying that they went in and killed every single last man, woman, and child. It's a very different claim.
Yeah, but
So what evidence do you have that this language is intended to be, this language in this genre of text is intended to be taken literally, given that a series of leading Egyptologists who have studied this text have written entire books arguing the contrary? What evidence do you have that this is literal? What rebuttal do you have to the evidence they present? Because all you're saying to me is, I read something on the internet that says this.
But what I meant, I'm neither a biblical scholar nor a theologian, so I cannot really give you an in-depth analysis of the situation. But
this is the problem: is people come in and they say, "This has been decisively shown," and I'm wanting to say, "Okay, I'm interested to consider that I'm wrong. Where's the argument?"
Yeah, and you're right, and I should point out that even if I'm more on the theological left of the spectrum than on the right, I was disappointed by Stark's aggressive, dismissing, and arrogant tone in his books. In his book, it was really pretty unpleasant to read him at time because he was so condescending.
Well, at times I actually think that, I've had this discussion with Stark, and I don't intend to have it anymore because I don't think it goes anywhere. But in places, I think he actually misrepresents people. In several places, I could make this argument. But me and him have gone back and forth on this so many times. It's kind of got to the point where both of us, I think, have realised that it's largely pointless because, there's just too much bad blood, and there's too much, really, a case of, it seems to me, an inability to communicate on the issue. So me and him sort of said to one another, well, like, actually, let's just not doing this anymore because it just goes nowhere and it achieves nothing. But I didn't see anything. I haven't seen anything compelling to suggest that this is not hyperbolic language at all. I've read skeptics say to me, "Oh, Stark demonstrably proves this," but I don't even know that Stark himself necessarily even denies that the language and that hyperbole is pervasive in this literature. He gives a few citations of texts that are sometimes used to show this. He suggests other ways they might possibly be read. Some of them more plausible than others. But I don't think he really does anything that would lead you to suggest that Younger is wrong about... you got to realize Younger's work. What Younger does is he finds a series of kind of stereotyped figures of speech, if you like, which occur in all these ancient Near Eastern warfare texts. So there's this kind of standard stereotypical way that they use over and over and over again. So one of them, I think, is something like, he made them like chaff, or he made them non-existent. And this phrase, he made them non-existent, occurs in numerous different texts, and it's a very comprehensive study, and he goes through and he breaks down the different kinds of things, and he goes through numerous, half a dozen Egyptian texts, half a dozen Hittite texts, half a dozen, and he goes through it and he breaks down all these different literary techniques. He breaks down all these different ways of doing things. Then he goes to the book of Joshua and shows Joshua follows the same rhetoric, And Young is not the only one who does this. I mean, when I was doing my research for my book, I was amazed how often this is just taken for granted. And literally, you read the commentaries, and people take for granted that it's hyperbolic. Even on the left of the theological scholarship, this is often expressed. Yes, we know this. So I don't see anything to say that this is not hyperbolic. And there's another I think an underlying moral point that I'd make here too is that, I believe that when you read someone else's work, you should read it charitably.
Yeah.
So I believe when you read someone else's work, you should try and think to yourself, okay, you shouldn't try and put the worst possible spin on it. You should say, okay, I'm going to look at it. I'm going to try and find the most charitable reading of this work. Now, if it turns out that that's just indefensible, the person is clearly saying something ridiculous, then of course, fine. But I think the burden of proof in this discussion is on the person who wants to take a particular passage literally when it doesn't fit with the rest of the text, and insist on taking it literally, and then saying this is really, really nasty. Charity would suggest that if you can interpret it charitably, you should, I would say.
Yeah, I
want to see some more evidence and argument that this is not hyperbolic, other than just the mere assertion that. And this is one of the things I find a bit odd about skeptics. Is skeptics often approach the text like extreme fundamentalists. I'm not saying it's about top dark, but skeptics often approach the text in almost a proof text message where it's about, let's go to the Bible, let's pull out a single passage, usually from the King James, let's cite it, let's take take for granted that it's completely literal and it clearly means what I say, and then they say it means something terrible. And often I'm willing to say, I never read that text that way at all.
But I found out that anti-theist or the new atheist, however you want to call them, turn out in many cases to be former fundamentalists. And as a consequence, it makes a lot of sense that as fundamentalists, that they have kept a fundamentalist mindset, like for example, the folks are debunking Christianity, and as a consequence now they pick and choose all verses or in the Bible and all worst interpretation which will help them build up their case that the Bible is an evil book. That's how anti-theists proceed all the time, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that there's something intellectually dishonest about that. I think, and I don't just say this about the Bible. I think this is about, anything. I mean, if I'm wanting to look into Islam, let's say, I'm not a Muslim, but if I'm going to look into Islam, it's not really good enough for me to pick up the Quran, read through it myself and say, I found this terrible passage. Obviously, the Quran is evil or something like that. I would want to know, well, how have Muslims understand this passage? How have Muslims interpreted it historically? What do Muslim scholars say about this passage? Why do they say it? What are their arguments? Now, after I've assessed that, I might come to the conclusion, oh my goodness, this is a terrible passage. But I think it would be just really, really flippant and just very, very intellectually dishonest to just pick the Quran up, particularly when it's written in Arabic. Pick the Quran up off the shelf in a bookstore somewhere, translate it into English, pull out a verse and say, it says this. That just strikes me as intellectually very, very dishonest, and there's almost an arrogance, I think, about that, as though you have this ability to make these kinds of assessments without doing the hard work that needs to be done. When I was studying philosophy, and you read the works of Plato, you don't get to dismiss Plato until you've read his arguments, until you've sat down and read Plato and understood his position and really grasped what he's trying to say. And then you can offer an argument against them, and you might offer an argument against them. Plato says some really crazy things in places. But, anyone who just sort of pulled Plato's Republic off the shelf that was written in English and just pulled out a word out of Plato's Republic and says, look, Plato says this, blah, 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 would be laughed out of a first-year philosophy class if they took that method. And I think this is just the way you approach ideas you disagree with in general. You should try and ask yourself, how do people... It's not about how do you react when you read the individual passage given your background. It's about how do people who treat this text seriously, how do they understand this passage?
Yeah.
What do they think it is? Why do they think that? What reasons have they got for it? What do commentators say about this passage? That's the kind of serious intellectual work that's needed. And the new atheists, not all atheists are like this, but the new atheists are terrible at that.
Yeah. And
yeah.
you mentioned the problem. You are entirely right. I completely agree with you on that. And for example, in Europe, this way of handling the Quran is precisely what far-right groups do all the time. I certainly believe you can find argument against Quranic inerrancy, for instance, but you cannot do that just by picking and choosing the worst verses, the worst interpretation, and then proclaiming we have shown that Islam is a terrible religion. That's propaganda. That's really not honest intellectual criticism of a religion, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think it's part of the problem. I mean, one of the things the internet has done is given us huge amounts of information at our fingertips, and I think one of the problems we have is we seem to have lots of people who don't know how to assess information.
Yeah, bullshit.
Yeah, so you can find any site saying anything. The issue is are you willing to? And there's also a sense in which I find sometimes as you know, I have a web blog and I do a lot of stuff online and what have you. And sometimes you kind of get the sense with some people, not all of them, we don't want to say this about all skeptics because it would be grossly unfair to say that, but I think with some skeptics, you get this almost this intellectual laziness where it's like, if you don't give me, the answer in this com box in 20 words, then I can dismiss what you have to say. And sometimes you can give an answer in 20 words in a com box, but sometimes, in actual fact, this person is being incredibly lazy if they expect that is how they're going to get answers about certain kinds of questions. Sometimes being informed about something actually requires a bit of work. It requires you. I've written very little on Islam myself. There's a chapter in our book on Islam by Paul. I didn't write it. And the reason I don't write it is I've never really looked into Islam in any great depth. I know a little bit about it, and I hear things here and there, but I don't want to put anything down to paper on my blog about Islam unless I've checked it out myself. Unless I've sort of looked at it and thought it through and what have you. That's not because I'm Muslim. I'm not. I'm a Christian. It's because I just don't think that's the way you should approach those kinds of issues. And this is the thing. I did a philosophy degree before I did a theology degree. In philosophy, we study diverse different viewpoints, but it's really important that we understand those viewpoints. It's really important that we understand the arguments carefully, and we understand what the person meant when he was saying that, and what his position is, and why he held it. And it requires being able to understand a mindset you disagree with. And I'm glad I did that training in philosophy, because I think it's really useful training in general, that you have to be able to say, okay, I disagree with this position, but I'm also able to understand that person's point of view accurately enough to say that I disagree with it.
Yeah, and but now, as for the fact is that all people engaged in a culture war are not interested in rigorously searching for truth, but in winning an argument, and that's why they build up straw men all the time, and they don't think. I have realized this a lot while arguing with both fundamentalist and militant atheist. In neither case did they try to understand what my positions truly are. And I have the impression that Tom Stark at times did the same thing towards Paul and you. I find many of his arguments plausible, but he didn't seem to have made a real effort to understand what you really thought. He kind of saw you as apologist. He had to kind of put down.
Well, see, I'm actually not an apologist. I'm a theologian and an ethicist, right? So you know, I mean, the word apologist, the word apology in Greek simply means, it's a Greek word that referred to a rational defense of a position. When a person was tried in the court of law in ancient Greece, they didn't have lawyers at that time. People would have to defend themselves, so they would have to rebut the charges raised against you. So an apologist was someone who used their intellectual and rhetorical skills to rebut a charge raised against them. So all an apologist is someone who defends a position. You know, there are apologists for atheism, there are apologists for theism, there are apologists for every position of the sun. You know, I'm a theologian and I'm an ethicist. I write things online on the blog. I also try and write things in public peer-reviewed literature and what have you. You know, so you know, it's you know, and you know, so there is a sense in which I sometimes get a little bit annoyed that people kind of use this word apologist as though it's a way of saying that this person is a liar. You know? I don't think you should go around accusing other people of lying simply because they express a viewpoint that you disagree with. I'm not saying Tom did, but I think sometimes there's this use of this word, and there's the kind of thing that goes on behind it too, where they go, oh, he's obviously a liar because he's an apologist. The assumption they're making is this, is they're saying, my position is obviously so watertightly, dogmatically correct that only a liar could disagree with me. And I mean, come on, really? You know, like, really? If it's a 2,000 years of history of philosophical discussion and theological discussion where there's been, you know, debates about these things, and everybody who disagreed with you was lying because you're just so, I mean, come on. I mean, when somebody speaks like that, I think to myself, that person is really arrogant, you know.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like there is this sort of sense that, you know, it's a reality in our world that people just will disagree. People disagree with us. People who are intelligent and well thought out on almost any philosophical issue of any significance, you can find people on both sides of it. That doesn't mean that I'm wrong. Doesn't mean that we're wrong. No, but it does mean that we shouldn't get an overinflated sense of our own, you know, kind of intellectual abilities, as though somehow we're this absolute genius and we've figured everything out completely, and anyone who disagrees with us is just a moron, you know. That kind of attitude, I find, you know, I just find it's beyond belief to believe that it's actually seriously there.
I agree, but now, as for Stark's argument, it seems to me that it's a pretty good one to point out that harem warfare involved the annihilation of all civilians, because otherwise there would be no difference with other kinds of warfares found at other places in the Bible.
Okay, now that argument was an interesting one. I think that argument there is based on a misunderstanding of what I was saying, right? May not have been. I mean, I'm not going to speak for Paul here, but in terms of what I've written, and it's interesting that this wasn't a response to me; it was a response to Paul. But what I said about the use of the language was that the language, what was hyperbolic, was the claim that all people were destroyed, that there were no survivors, that, you know, that's compatible with saying that some people were destroyed. I believe that some people were destroyed. I never denied that. So, you know, and I never denied that, and I certainly don't deny in my book that harem warfare involved the killing of non-combatants. What I stress is that it wasn't a case where they went in and killed every single man, woman, and child in the area. They went in, they raided the villages, they killed some, the rest took off and fled, you know, and this was the way they wrote it up. So I believe there's a moral problem in the text. The moral problem is that the text portrays God as commanding the killing of non-combatants. And in my book, I have quite a lot to say about that moral problem. But that's very different to claiming that the text is portraying God as commanding the genocidal slaughter of every single man, woman, and child in Canaan.
But I would say that even if, let's suppose, for the sake of the argument, that God did not, according to the authors of Joshua, did not order to soldiers to kill every child, if he just ordered to kill, I don't know, 20 babies, for me, it would be almost the same problem, unless you are an utilitarian, of course.
Sure, but I mean, like I said in there, I think there are two separate issues that need to be separated, and those are this: the issue of killing non-combatants, which I agree is a moral problem, and the issue of genocide. Those are moral problems, but they're not the same moral problem. It's a bit like, if I suspect my neighbour is beating his child, so I go around and tell people that he's raping his child. The claim that he's raping his child is still unjustified, even if he's beating his child. And it's a bit like that. The moral problem in the text is that God appears, and I don't think that God appears to allow or countenance the killing of non-combatants. The picture seems to be, as I read it anyway, that they attack the village and everyone sort of flees and gets away, and they don't take any prisoners. That's what I think really is going on. Is in normal warfare, they would they could take pregnant prisoners, they could integrate with the thing. And this thing, those people have to be driven out. If they don't leave, they die. And so they come into these villages, they hit them. I mean, whatever their village, whatever they are, but they come and they raid these areas. They kill some of the people who are around. The rest flee, run off to the hills, whatever. And the Israelites leave. They go back to their base camp in Gilgal, and these cities are all repopulated again. So it wasn't an issue of them being, as I said, of being commanded to kill every single man, woman, and child. It was an issue of going in there and doing what they did. Now, that means that they killed non-combatants. And I agree that's a moral problem, but I think that's a different moral problem. I think the problem of, killing non-combatants is a moral problem, but it's not the same as the problem of genocide. You couldn't get an indictment in the criminal court on genocide against someone simply because they killed a non-combatant. It's a different moral question. And when I wrote the first things I wrote on this topic on the internet, I was addressing the question that it was genocidal. I wasn't, at that stage, I didn't have any really carefully thought out positions on the issue of killing non-combatants, although I think that what I say in my book now is pretty much what I would have said then had I thought about it clearly. But so I think there's two different questions here. So I do believe you can address the question of non-combatants, philosophically and what have you. But the point I'm trying to say is, what I was saying when I wrote that was that the language that you get in Scripture, if you take it literally, is that they went and they killed every single person. They left nothing that breathed, and I just think that's hyperbole. That's not, and I got this from reading Kenneth Kitchen, who's an Egyptologist. And if you read what I quoted from Kenneth Kitchen says, yeah, they killed non-combatants. But the point is, this picture of this genocidal slaughter is not, is a mistake. It's taking the language literally. So we need to identify what the moral problem is before we address it. We don't get to read the text, exaggerate it into something it's not, and then attack the exaggeration. So yeah, I agree with you. I agree there is a moral problem there, but I don't think it's the same problem. I also think that you can address that problem in a way you can't address others, because I think the question of, is it ever in any circumstances permissible to kill non-combatants, is quite a different question to, is it ever in any circumstances permissible to commit genocide? I think you can answer yes to one of those. You can answer yes to the first of those questions and answer no to the second, for example. So I think they are different moral questions, and that's the stuff about hyperbole is in my book. It's not designed to be the silver bullet that solves all the moral problems. It's designed to show, look, these people have misread it, and they've talked about this genocidal slaughter. It's not a genocidal slaughter. What it is it's for a particular campaign or a particular campaign in Israel's history. The normal rules of non-combatancy were suspended for that particular campaign. That's the moral problem. Now, we can discuss that problem, fine, but that's a different problem to saying God commands us to commit genocide today, and it's a different problem saying God commands us to go out and kill every single man, woman, and child of someone just because they have a different religion to us, which the text doesn't say at all. I don't think. So I think that's the nuance. You have to look at what the text says carefully and see what the problem is to start with before you sort of jump into raising moral criticism. And like I said, I don't think you have the right to sort of say, well, look, because I object to one part of it, I can just object to something else that's not there, you know. So yeah.
Yeah,